Ableism props up the racism. The racism is not within a vacuum.
So I want you to watch that whole video from Imani, and I want you to listen very deeply to what she says, because I'm going to further affirm it with some points in history. Hi, my name is Evan. I'm a bioethicist, and I did my thesis on misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories as a threat to public health. So in that video, Imani is talking about how ableism props up racism and how ableism can be weaponized against anyone. And I'm going to give some specific examples in history where that was the bottom line of the ableism, and that's how it was utilized. So the easiest and best example for any bioethicist is going to be World War II, because in World War II, what predates what we know, because what a lot of people think about when we think about World War II is what happened for about the last 5 years. What a lot of us have not been taught or don't think about is the build up to those points. That we understand that there were concentration camps and unaliving camps, but we don't actually know how that happened. It's just like, did they just appear? When in all actuality, how it started was with the institutionalization and then the move to euthanization of people with disabilities. Now, this is not to say that the rhetoric against Jewish people didn't occur until later. It was happening the whole time. But it's to say that the way that they were able to make the general German populace comfortable with the idea was a slow boiling pot design, at least legislatively speaking. So there was a huge public health campaign related to the fact that an immense amount of poverty occurred in response to losing World War I, and that there was a lot of money that Germany owed all over, but specifically to the US. Unemployment, poverty, inflation, all of that was at an all-time high. And so the German people were seeking governance from folks who could promise that they could revitalize or bring back employment, income, all of that. This made it very easy to pass policy and to do a public health campaign, basically calling people with disabilities useless eaters. This was the language used for them. And that wouldn't we be able to do all these things with all this money if we didn't have to take care of these individuals? And the original suggestion was to build institutions right outside of urban spaces and ship them off and institutionalize folks. And after some time of being institutionalized, it was like, aren't these institutions such a drag on the government and the financial responsibilities that we have? What if we just decided which one of them don't have a good quality of life? And again, this was a huge public health campaign. It is this policy that would later on be expanded continuously to also include Romani people, LGBTQ people, Jewish people, all these folks. Because the policy stated that people had to be found incompetent and that they had to become wards of the state. And then in becoming wards of the state, then they could be shipped off to these places. Do you see the connection here? It was the widespread popularity and buy-in of these policies and legislation that allowed for an ever-building fascist regime to then extend it to everybody that did not fit their definition of Aryan. Now, if you say to yourself, well, that could never happen here, I'm going to correct you on that as well, with the example of the Osage community. In the late 19th century, the Osage Nation would purchase land from the Cherokee Nation and move all of its members onto that land. Not long after, what was discovered underneath the land was an exorbitant amount of oil and natural minerals. Very, very expensive, very, very important. Now, because of the sovereignty of the people in the Osage Nation, and because they operated independently or have their own kind of independent government to some extent, especially as owners of the property that they were on, all business had to deal with them in order to access this oil and the natural minerals that occurred on their land. This made the Osage Nation incredibly wealthy, ostentatiously, outrageously wealthy. I mean, a billionaire, multi-times over nation. And because of the structure of the community, it meant every individual in the Osage Nation had a certain allotment of that wealth. They all were wealthy, not any one of them, all of them. Obviously, the larger system of white supremacy and these corporate capitalist organizations did not want to be paying into what was deemed a less valuable group of people, making them ostentatiously wealthy in order to access these natural resources that they wanted to extract from their land. But they had no other way of being able to acquire it because of the design of the treaties around this land. So what these entities did was lobby the government to find individuals in the Osage Nation, all of them, to be indigent or to be unable to govern themselves. Basically the way you have to find somebody in order to place them in conservatorship. It's like what you have to prove in order to enact conservatorship. This meant that in order to access any of their own wealth, they had to have a conservator. Now, obviously, the Osage people were smart enough to know that they didn't want to have just some external conservator, so it became very hard to pitch to them as an outside individual, especially a white one, that you wanted to be their conservator, because they had had a number of people obviously try to walk off with wealth and their money. So what would more effectively happen is that white men would come into the Osage community and convince the women to marry them and make them a conservator, because a white person could be, even if it was their spouse. And then ultimately, a upcropping of mysterious and very sudden deaths would occur. This decimated the population to this day, and it also created a consistent siphoning off of the Osage wealth, because conservators could access their money for any number of reasons, to either care for them or to provide to them, which they would very rarely see handed directly to them. This is ableism being utilized as a tool, a systemic tool, to enforce racism, to keep wealth out of the hands of indigenous people. And because so many people are comfortable with overt, obvious systemic ableism in policy and legislation, especially around things like being able to control the bodies and the finances of these individuals, nobody batted an eye when it was utilized as a way to siphon off wealth from an entire community. Now, I know there's a few of you who are still left that are saying, yeah, but that was just an indigenous population. The rest of us were fine, and they're a small group anyway. I'm going to fix that for you with the ugly laws. Sir Francis Galton in the 1800s would come up with the concept of eugenics, and it would become incredibly popular here in the U.S. People became obsessed with the desirable groups and undesirable groups and separating people therein. Now, it's no surprise that basically every race except for white people, particularly the Victorian era British people of the gentleman class, would be considered undesirable groups. But so too would be people with disabilities. This would create or be kind of a base concept for what was called the ugly laws. And this was a series of laws that were enacted all the way through the 1900s, all the way up to the last one I think was rescinded in the 1970s. Basically, these laws stated that if you offended other people with the way that you looked, you could be institutionalized or thrown out of urban space. This applied to people that were impoverished, people with disabilities, especially people with visible physical disabilities, people who were drunk, any number of people that were deemed undesirables, sex workers, any of it. Now, the question was, what do we do with all these people so they're not hanging around outside making everyone else sick with the way that they look? Now, there were already things like leprosy colonies and institutions for people to be put away who had leprosy or who had tuberculosis. So they expanded this concept to also include people with disabilities, because you don't have to worry about someone repeatedly offending the ugly laws if you've just got full control of their bodies. But as time passed, what you could be institutionalized could be expanded more excessively, again, with the expansion, starting with one group and then expanding. This would lead to the ability to be able to institutionalize someone for being LGBTQ, and particularly for institutionalizing women for being hysterical. This would also be called getting a case of the vapors, and that was often used as a way to offend a man. Hysteria was exclusively a women's disease, and it was basically any woman who didn't want to listen. It was a carte blanche way to lock a woman up. And this has always been the technique, just so that we're aware, is using health and medicine, particularly being able to proclaim somebody as disabled in order to control their body and in order to enact ways to subjugate an entire group. Even enslaved people's urge to run away from enslavement was given a term or coined under a disabling terminology called drapetomania. Being comfortable with ableism means that at some point you would be comfortable with some form of fascism, so long as it doesn't overtly target you first. It will target you at some point.